I'd like to welcome our first presenter. Ann-Maree AMKMQ Quaynor graduates with a BFA in painting and an AB in International and Public Affairs in the development track. Her capstone project is supervised by Brown's Lizzie Gottlieb. Welcome, AMKMQ.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jordan. It's my pleasure to present my capstone presentation with everyone today. I would just like to share my slides with you to begin. And just to reiterate, my name is AMQ. I am a final year dual degree student studying painting with a conjuncted focus in film studies and international public affairs with a focus in development. I consider myself both an artist, researcher, writer, and an activist, particularly a film activist. And my key overarching thesis for my capstone is the concept of transdimensional painting, which I will get into in a moment. Just to again give a brief background in terms of my practice, I would just read my introduction. I am a distinguished scholar in the Brown RISD dual degree program, where I study international and public affairs at Brown and painting with film studies at RISD. My academic pursuits have centered on development economics, post-colonial cultural production, and Afro-media, as I weave together my interdisciplinary passions to explore the transformative power of art and policy. I identify not solely as an artist, writer, or researcher, but as a film activist, and I aim to use my craft to inspire social change and to amplify traditionally underrepresented voices through Afro-media. Just to speak briefly, to run through the key themes that will be spoken about in terms of my overarching capstone project and also my time here at RISD and Brown. And the key themes in my practice are Afrofuturism, post-colonial analysis, cultural cannibalization, world building, art as activism, and metaphysics. And to begin, I'd just like to present 5 minutes of my thesis film to give context to where I'm at in my practice, and I will just show you now. The film, just to give a little brief synopsis background, this film is called Magenta. It was, I guess, the seed of the next level of my sort of experimental filmmaking that I find myself in at this time. It was shot exclusively on an iPhone 12 Pro in Lagos during the chaos and election of pre-election, the chaos and violence of pre-election violence in Nigeria in 2022. And in this project, we aim to create a short film that was meant to be an Afro-surrealist art film that is largely silent, that aims to dissect themes of post-colonial analysis, living in the diaspora and back home, and ancestrality as it relates to modern day health in West African women. So I would just like to show you 5 minutes right now. Thank you. I would really love to be able to show you the full film, but for right now, I'm just going to, as I speak to you about the overarching themes of my practice, I would actually just like to give a few more details on this film. I'm very inspired by the original ethics of Nollywood, actually, in which they focused on a sort of mode of guerrilla filmmaking, where you make the most with the least or most basic resources possible, because they were making a lot of films during the military dictatorship, and this meant that traditional media and traditional production companies were just not a thing anymore. And we kind of, people had to use a sort of a sense of street resistance and combine that with this desire to make art and to also make art about our own realities. And I especially feel as a West African American, I'm at the crux of so many different identities and world experiences. And I found that when I came to RISD, this is something that also factored into my experience in the dual degree program and at RISD. And last thing on Magenta, it also went on to win the award for Best Experimental Film at the 2023 Ivy Film Festival, which was even more encouraging and empowering about this overarching idea in my films, which I'll get further into, where I really believe in Afro media as a tool for activism and a tool for um, creative resistance, but resistance in itself and international development, in which we amplify our traditionally underrepresented voices and excavate others as well, and allow ourselves to self-empower and step out of the hegemonic narrative to empower ourselves in our own narratives. And just to get into my practice itself, and the overarching theme of transdimensional painting is kind of an approach in which I think of painting not merely as a formal skill, but also a sort of conceptual way of thinking, seeing, and creating, in which you import, the same sort of mechanisms in which a painter uses when they sit in front of a painting with a blank canvas, and you ask yourself, well, I only have a still image, although films are multiple still images at once moving. It's almost like asking yourself, what is the absolute essence of what I'm trying to say, in the sense of what am I trying to get my viewer to feel? The same way that you use a certain color to imbue a certain emotion in a painting, I feel that I became very interested in creating a sort of universal visual emotional language that will touch all sorts of identities rather than something that is static in its form or in its medium. So it's sort of a conceptual way of approaching making. And throughout my time at RISD and in the dual degree program when I first came, um, particularly due to my multidisciplinary approach to my work, I was often asked why I chose painting instead of FAV and graphic design, and I never understood why exactly because I felt that I was kind of exactly where I needed to be. Whether I was using painting, sculpture, video, or the likes, or I felt that I approached each method with the same conceptual tenets that a painter painting a painting would. And just bringing this back to the questions I found myself asking over and over, how can I bottle this visceral feeling of being stopped in your tracks when you are in a gallery and you see a painting and it just touches your humanity without even speaking to you? And this was particularly also because when I first came, I came in 2018. It was a slightly different time. There were still a lot more rooms of silence at RISD in critiques. And just to explain briefly, like what a room of silence is, it's essentially um, moments in which people who are from minority identities are almost like unintentionally ostracized from discussion and critique or from genuine critique because people who are from majorities either it's not always badly intentioned. They may just feel that they can only enter a person's work through the prism of their race or their identity or their ethnicity as it relates to that major identity. And it led to a lot of moments in which I would have to spend extra time with a teacher to get feedback because the people in my class didn't really know how to enter my work through prisms outside of race. And because that's not the primary driving force behind my work, it was getting continually frustrating. I found myself wanting to meditate on themes of the human existence, past race itself, and my race and racial experiences obviously implicit in my lived experience, but I found that I wanted to go past that. So I found myself asking, how can I create a universal visual emotional language that would transcend all of these preconceived notions, whether they were well-intentioned or badly intentioned? How can I speak to my very specific truths to almost any person, the same way that if you go and view a painting, you're not immediately projecting that person's identity versus if they were standing right next to the painting. Um, and so this was all important for me to establish, and it definitely drove home my desire for making multidisciplinary work, but it was more so being a creative mode of thinking and making. So, for example, with this painting, the painting at the back is actually a sculpture, like a 3D sculpture that I made, which was made on corrugated steel and acrylic paint. And I find myself constantly wanting to move between the 2D, 3D, and also conceptual realms to make work and find that this sort of multidimensionality is where I find I can communicate in the fullest way. So with a piece like this, I would start with a 3D. I've started with the 3D painting. I take it into the 2D and I manipulated it into Photoshop into this room. I printed it out again and I went over the sides of the wall with extra paint, scanned that again, and did some more digital collage. And I really just think that I think of my work as also world building and in the same way of like transferring the physical to the digital and having this sort of relationship between the two and not having them be like stagnant points that you just reach at one point, much like my own journey in the dual degree program. Um, I wanted to establish my practice in a way that there were many levels on which my work can be understood, felt, and received, because there are a lot of instances in which we're receiving art that we are thinking first, but not realizing the things we immediately receive and intake as a human. And that transcends color, composition, narrative. And these are also the reason why I call my films moving paintings, because I use those same tenets to approach how I communicate through my films as well, because I very much like to play with this idea of communicating and communicating with language and how that the concept of language actually transcends like spoken language or even just English. And I often think of like even just people who are bilingual or multilingual. I'm bilingual, but people who English isn't their first language, and oftentimes they talk about how much more potent they can express things in their own language versus English. And it just made me think of like the limitations of spoken language as well. And that made me really want to create a language that could touch anybody, even if they have different reactions, the things that are communicated could be the same. Um, and this is also, as I said, what brought me to my moving paintings, as I do not see them merely as films, but as multiversal visual narratives in themselves, that are meant to be experiential at first glance. I really want people to feel my work before they think about my work, and that's very important to me across my work at both Brown and RISD. I also found that in terms of the points at which both my degrees met, a lot of my research in international and public affairs at Brown has constantly fed into the themes in my creative practice, the themes of resistance, of international development, of post-colonial cultural production. I genuinely believe in this symbiotic relationship between different modes of understanding, whether it is different ways of creating, like sculpture, painting, digital, or research and the creative. I really believe that I can, not just me, but art itself can be used as a tool for activism and for global development. And that's just something that's very important in my work, to create these narratives that are something that you stop and experience first before you even start to force yourself to think. I feel like we are animals at our core as much as we are also thinking beings. And I really wanted to get to the core of what is like the human experience. Like, how can I put an image in front of someone and not only have them be like, oh, this is a cool painting, but this is making me feel things I may not even have the words for yet. Um, and and I just really am also very interested in texture, because I feel that that is something, whether it is the 2D, 3D, scripture, um, sculpture, painting, video, projections, drawings. I really love this idea of multi-dimensional texture, even with writing and even with film, and having a lot of dimensions on which an artistic statement can exist. And just to again explain that my future plans, where I feel that my moving paintings are taking me, which I will likely continue to call them even as they get to bigger scales and have more English language in them. I would just like to speak briefly about my future plans upon completing my degrees. Upon completion of my dual degree, I am excited by the prospect of gaining firsthand experience in the global film and production industries as I continue to sow the seeds of AMKMQ Studios. This will be a multimedia organization that focuses on Afro media and producing diasporic stories around the world and in the format of films, television series, books, video games, Afro tourism, and educational programs. I would also like to attend the David Geffen School of Drama at Yale to study acting and/or directing before pursuing a further career in elevating underrepresented voices in the entertainment industry. Ultimately, I would like to return home to establish an agglomeration of specialized multidisciplinary girls' schools across the diaspora. These schools will be called Yawa, which stands for Young African Women in Art, and they will be a series of secondary schools that focus on empowering diasporic female voices through the study of the intersections between art, academia, and science and technology, much like the experience that I was blessed to have in the dual degree program. And I believe that this is how I will best combine my love for art, storytelling, and international development and activism. And I really just want to work towards the change I want to see in the world with the tools that I have best at my disposal. And I also feel that just in an overarching statement, I feel that representation is power and should honestly just not be underestimated in its strength to break barriers and uplift communities, and can be a very powerful tool for resistance, for community building, and for empowering, empowerment rather. But that's all for me, and I want to thank you so much for staying with me for these 20 minutes and listening to my practice. And if you have any questions, I would love to. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, AMQ.